Hello, everyone. This is Thomas Sir. I'm the CEO of Kinexum. Welcome to our June webinar, Resources for Public Health Defense, BARDA, NIH, Medical Countermeasures, and COVID-19. The panel presentation and discussion will be led by Kinexum's Defense and National Security Practice Head, Dean Calcagni, MD, who will introduce the other speakers. There is one change on the program from what was announced. Steven Grossman, formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS, was unexpectedly called away on an urgent matter. Steven's slides remain in the presentation and will be presented by panelist Carol Linden, former Principal Deputy Director of BARDA. A couple housekeeping points first. Please confirm that you're on mute on your phone and on your computer mic to help with everyone's sound quality. 2, if you have a question along the way, please type it into the chat box and we will get to as many as we have time for. 3, we are recording this webinar. A YouTube video of the panel presentation and Q&A and the PDF version of the slides will be posted to our Kinexum website within a couple business days. Registrants will receive links by email when these materials are ready. 4th, if this topic is of special interest to you, I'd invite you to please call or email the panelists for further information. And finally, the next Kinexum webcast will be on July 10 on the future of transformative interventions for type 1 diabetes, presented by a panel of distinguished international experts, moderated by Dr. Jay Schuyler, himself a preeminent authority on the topic and a past president of the American Diabetes Association. Our September webinar will be on aging biomarkers in regulatory development of anti-aging therapies, including Steve Horvath of UCLA, discoverer of the DNA methylation biological clock, and legendary FDA official Bob Temple. Now, a few words about our moderator today, Dean Calcagni, MD. After an undergraduate biology degree from MIT, Dean earned his medical degree at the University of Vermont. He has had a 26-year military career, retiring with the rank of colonel. He spent 18 of those years at the United States Army Medical Research and Development Command, headquartered at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. Dean, please take the mic.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is a real pleasure to be with you all and to be able to talk to you about the organizations and the processes that have been a part of my professional life for so many years. Slide, please, Jennifer. Next one. Okay, before we dive into the planned presentation, there have been some recent developments, and I wanted to bring this to your attention. On May 15th, President Trump announced an initiative called Operation Warp Speed, and then just a few days ago on June 15th, they issued a 3-page fact sheet. Now, Operation Warp Speed is a public-private partnership with multiple government organizations from HHS, DOD, as well as private industry. The goal of this initiative is to accelerate the development and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and other related products. This is headed by Moncef Slaoui from GlaxoSmithKline, formerly of GlaxoSmithKline. And while he was there, Moncef Slaoui led the successful development of 5 different vaccines. On the government side, as the Chief Operating Officer, is General Perna, 4-star general, who is currently the Commanding General of the Army Materiel Command. The government funding for this initiative is $10 billion, billion with a B. $6.5 billion of that is going to BARDA, and Carol's going to be telling you a lot more about BARDA in just a few minutes. And then $3 billion going to the NIH for research. Next slide, please. So, what we're going to be talking about today, we'll be looking at the tech-based versus advanced development and the medical product life cycle. I'll tell you about a few organizations in the DoD that are doing medical R&D. We'll talk about something called medical countermeasures. And then we'll move on and talk about some important funding mechanisms that the federal government has for medical research and development. Carol's going to do a deep dive into BARDA, and then we're going to finish up talking about how do you find these opportunities that are out there. Next slide, please. The organizations that are out there, we're not going to talk about all of them. We will talk about the Army Medical Research and Development Command. The Navy and the Air Force also have their own programs, but they're much smaller, and we're not going to be talking about them today. We're also not going to be talking about the VA. On the domestic side, as we mentioned, we'll be doing a lot of discussion about BARDA. Most of you on the call today know about the FDA. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the FDA, and we'll also spend a little time on the NIH. Next slide. So you're probably all familiar with these different colored blocks showing the medical product life cycle. But a couple of things I want to point out, those numbers going from left to right, 6.1 to 6.7, these are DoD funding lines. And so if you come across these in your travels, you'll know what they're referring to. The other nomenclature I want to bring to your attention are those red circles at the bottom of that box, and those are technology readiness levels. This was a system originally developed by NASA and then adopted by DoD, and then further adopted and further modified by the Army Medical R&D Command so that it could be used for medical products. Next slide, please. So we talk about tech base, which is on the left-hand side, which is the technology base. It's also referred to as S&T. So if you hear that term, that's what we're talking about, which is science and technology. And then on the right-hand side, which is advanced development, which is just called advanced development. Next slide. First organization we're going to talk about is MRDC, headquartered at Fort Detrick. Subordinate labs and commands across the country and throughout the world. And it has a large extramural research program. This is where you come in. Next slide. Just a quick overview on MRDC programs, combat casualty care. This program I had the pleasure of leading a few years ago when I was the program area director. And what we were focused on was empowering the medic to help keep that injured serviceman alive until he could be evacuated to the field medical hospital. Blood and blood products, blood substitutes, perhaps some initial burn care, perhaps some initial treatment for traumatic brain injury. Next area, operational medicine. Well, when our servicemen get deployed, obviously there's the threat of the enemy doing harm to them, but they're also generally in a very austere environment, often a very hot environment, as well as an environment that has all types of psychological stressors. So the operational medicine research program is designed to develop those types of things to allow our service people to operate at maximum efficiency. Clinical and rehab program. This is after the casualty has reached a field medical hospital and has started the evacuation and treatment process through the various echelons of medical care. A lot of focus on prosthetics, a lot of focus on regenerative medicine, as well as burn care. And then the final one there in that group, medical simulation and IT. Not a lot of funding in this area. Most of the funding goes to demonstration programs so that the various groups involved in DoD at healthcare administration can become aware of technologies that are emerging from the IT sector. And then in terms of health defense, we'll be talking about medical countermeasures. And this includes naturally occurring infectious diseases such as COVID-19. So then at the bottom, you can see MRDC is involved in all phases of medical product research and development. A lot of emphasis in the tech base on the left. In advanced development, they have limited funding. They're more interested in developing what they call COTS products, commercial off-the-shelf products. Most of the funding in advanced development at MRDC goes to funding vaccine development for tropical diseases, infectious diseases. Next slide, please. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this organization, the MTEC. Next slide. The MTEC is a Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium. And a lot of the DoD research organizations have created a counterpart to the MTEC. And what this consists of is a nonprofit organization affiliated with the government organization, in this case MRDC. And it's organized through something called Other Transaction Agreement, the OTA provisions of the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. This allows a lot of creative partnerships that would not otherwise be allowed under the Federal Acquisition Regulations. The catch is that if you want to participate in the MTEC, you have to be a member of the MTEC, and you can see the dues listed there at the bottom. Next slide, please. This is an example of just a few of the many solicitations they've had recently. You can see I've circled there at the top. They've had an initiative for COVID-19. The Navy has participated on some of these initiatives, and they cover a broad spectrum of the areas that we were just talking about. Next slide, please. So we alluded to medical countermeasures a bit, and Thomas told you that our scheduled speaker, Steven Grossman, is not with us today. Steven, of course, is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS. But Carol Linden has graciously agreed to fill in for Steven. And so let me tell you a little bit about Carol. Next slide, please. And go on to Carol. Thank you. So Carol has been the Director of the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation at the FDA. She's been the Principal Deputy Director at BARDA. She has been the Deputy Director for the Office of Research and Development in the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. She was the Chief of Research Plans and Programs at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRD. And she is now a Kinexum senior consultant on federal agencies such as the FDA and the HHS. Carol, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dean. So these are Steve's slides, and I will try to do them justice. Talking about medical countermeasures, medical countermeasures is really a term of art for describing those biologics, drugs, and devices that are intended to be used in a public health emergency arising either from chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear events, or from emerging infectious diseases. They're really, in large part, products that don't have a day job, although we would like to be able to use commercial products for treating these kinds of things that arise from events, for CBRN events especially. But most of the time, these are very unique products that have pretty singular purposes. So they're developed, or their development is supported by the government, they're purchased by the government, and they're put into the Strategic National Stockpile, which you probably heard a lot about a couple months ago with respect to the issue of having ventilators available during this COVID-19 pandemic. But, as I just said, it is highly desirable for these products to have a day job or a commercial market. But, given that most of them might not, could I have the next slide, please? We have to think like a crisis planner for developing these products. One always needs to first envision essentially the end game. What is the concept of use or the concept of operations going to be in a particular situation arising from chem, bio, or grad group event or an emerging infectious disease? What are the populations that might be affected? Who's going to need access to the medical countermeasures? How can they be provided to them expeditiously or in an appropriate time frame? An example would be a medical countermeasure for acute radiation syndrome arising from, say, for example, a dirty bomb in Lower Manhattan. In that kind of a situation, you would need therapies that can be administered to large numbers of people very expeditiously. I might also add parenthetically, having worked in this area when I was at BARDA, that you also need to be able to figure out who needs treatment. So that's another piece of the puzzle here. The next slide is merely meant to illustrate the kind of decision tree thinking that would need to take place in an event. In this case, the example is anthrax. Figuring out who would need post-exposure prophylaxis, who would need to be diagnosed, who would need to be treated with various different kinds of products. Go ahead, the next slide, please. So when developing products for these unique kinds of threats that are not naturally occurring infectious diseases, many years ago, the FDA promulgated what is known as the animal rule. It actually has a much longer descriptive title, but it is the FDA regulations for product development and testing when human efficacy studies are not ethical and field trials are not feasible. And what this body of rule and regulation says is that the FDA can rely on adequate and well-controlled animal efficacy studies to support approval under the animal rule. I will say that this is not a shortcut or an easier pathway to product approval than the traditional product development pathway. FDA has published extensive guidance on this. The title of the principal document is Product Development Under the Animal Rule. So under the animal rule, one needs a model, an animal model that the FDA will accept as mimicking the human disease. And then one would need to be able to demonstrate animal safety, efficacy, dosing, how you approximate dosing in an animal and relate that to a human, the mechanism of action, and the correlative protection. And I might point out also that they want to see the same kind of human safety studies that you would need to see in a traditional development process. And the bottom line is no one really knows whether a countermeasure is going to work unless it's, until it's actually getting used. So they want to make sure they have as much information as possible. And there are also some requirements around collecting information if and when these products are used. So the next slide is just illustrating the different data elements that go into a submission under the animal rule. This is just a little snapshot. The moral of the story, or the bottom line, is don't be afraid to ask for help. The FDA invites, still expects, and wants people to come talk to them early in the process of developing a product that might be considered for approval under the animal rule. And that is the last slide in this set, so I'll hand it back to Dean, I believe.
Thank you, Carol. And Carol will be back with us in a couple of minutes talking about BARDA. But now we're going to talk about funding mechanisms. Next slide, please. We'll talk about 4 funding mechanisms: the BAW, SBIRs, RFPs, and the numerous types of funding opportunity announcements that the NIH has. Next slide, please. So the broad agency announcement. If you're going to respond to a broad agency announcement, relax. Take your time. There's no rush. You can submit anytime. Generally, the broad agency announcement is updated every 12 months. And the scope, as the name implies, is broad. It's intended to cover all of the organization's R&D programs. It's not intended for a service contract, just for R&D programs. Next slide, please. So what's in the BAW? It's going to have detailed program descriptions. It's going to give you a lot more detail than I was able to do just a few minutes ago talking about the MRDC programs. It's going to be telling you how to apply for it, how they administer it, Next slide. The FDA even has its own broad agency announcement, but this BA just contains topics that are intended to improve the FDA's processes. If you're interested in getting more information about the FDA's BA, let me know. Next slide, please. BARDA. In just a few minutes, Carol's going to be telling us about BARDA. BARDA not only has a BA, they have a super BA, my terminology. So in addition to their main BA, they have 2 additional important subsections of the BA. They have a COVID-19 section, and they also have what they call the Easy BA for molecular diagnostics. Next slide. SBIRs. Every federal organization conducting research has an SBIR program, and phase 1 awards can go up to $250,000, phase 2 up to $1 million. But the catch is you have to have a project that has the potential for commercialization. And then there's the associated program, the STTR program, which allows a small business to partner typically with a university. Next slide. Requests for proposals. This is page 1 of an RFP that I was a part of a few years ago. It was a 200-page RFP, and there's so much gobbledygook there. This is page 1. They don't even have the title of the RFP on page 1. You have to wait till you get to page 2. Very complex documents. Next slide, please. And an RFP, just like we said, you can relax with a BA. You cannot relax with the RFP. You have to be vigilant. Typically, the RFP comes out and they're due several weeks after they get posted. Narrow in scope, tended to be for advanced development, whereas the BA tends to be for the tech base. As we said, you really need to be on your toes looking for these. Sometimes you'll get a little heads up with an RFI, request for information, but not always. Next slide. The NIH funding opportunity announcements. This is actually one that we developed a proposal to over the past few months. This is an RO1. You can see that top red circle. And then the funding opportunity announcement in the bottom circle. RO1s, and let's go on to the next slide. RO1s are the oldest and the most common of the NIH research grant mechanisms, and they have standard dates for submission. If you miss the February 5 date, you can slip it to June 5. They accept those proposals 3 different times a year. Here's the statistics. The NIH received over 20,000 applications for RO1s. They funded only 17%. The average funding was about $500,000. Next slide. And to use a technical term, the NIH has a gazillion different funding opportunities, and they're all listed here. And so it's something that you need to figure out if it's something other than the RO1 that you're interested in applying to. Next slide. You know him, you love him, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Fauci. You've seen him on TV. He has been the NIAID director since 1984. And Steven Grossman was talking to us earlier, and his career overlapped a bit with Tony Fauci. He said when Tony came on board, from the first day that he came on board, he was highly, highly respected. And of course, NIAID is a major funder for COVID-19 R&D. Next slide. And I know on the call we have some folks from healthcare delivery organizations, so want to point out some additional aspects of COVID-19 funding. The FCC has a fair amount of funding to promote the use of telemedicine. CDC has funding for surveillance and data collection, and then you can see the list of philanthropic nonprofit organizations and their funding. Let's move on to the next slide. And let's talk about an organization called CDMRP. and they have programs across the entire spectrum, tech-based advanced development. Next slide, please. So CDMRP is congressionally directed medical research programs. This goes back to the early 90s when Hillary Clinton was the first lady, working with the breast cancer patient advocacy community. And they were very interested in getting some focused funding for breast cancer research into the federal budget. And the first lady was working with members of Congress, and she went to the NIH and said, well, we'll take the funding, but it'll go to cancer research. We do basic research. We don't do the kind of focused research that you're talking about. So the first lady went to DOD, and this is where this program gets started. And DOD executed those funds. And in the intervening almost 30 years, many other patient advocacy groups have broken the code. They've gone to their own lobbyist and found their own congressional sponsor who sponsored a congressional earmark for their disease. And now in the previous fiscal year, the funding was more than $1 billion with a B, $1 billion. And I should say that CDMRP is part of MRDC. And checking my notes here. And they do have some COVID-19 funding. Next slide, please. So during the Depression, there was a bank robber named Willie Sutton who was finally captured, and a reporter interviewed him and asked him, Willie, why do you rob banks? And his famous answer that may be an urban legend, he responded and said, well, that's where the money is. Well, in the COVID-19 area, the money is at BARDA. And I'd like to reintroduce Carol Linden, next slide please, who is a former principal deputy director of BARDA and is going to tell us all about BARDA. Carol, on to you.
Thank you, Dean. Hello again. Could I have the next slide, please? Excuse me. So BARDA was established in 2006 with the intention on the part of Congress that it would help, quote, bridge the valley of death for the development of products, excuse me, to address CBRN threats and pandemic influenza. So BARDA supports the development of vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics from late stage development through advanced development, and ultimately most desirable for consideration for approval by the FDA and, as appropriate, inclusion in the Strategic National Stockpile. BARDA is part of the Department of Health and Human Services and lives under the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Next slide, please. If you want to find BARDA most directly online, you go to a website called medicalcountermeasures.gov. A little bit kludgy, but that will get you to a page for BARDA that lists the topics that I show here on this slide. It describes the BARDA coronavirus response, provides links for the BARDA broad agency announcement and the COVID-19 easy broad agency announcement, as well as describes the COVID-19 medical countermeasure portfolio, and also provides a link to something called the U.S. Government Corona Watch, where you can request a meeting on vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, or other measures. Could I have the next slide, please? Through this Corona Watch portal on the BARDA website, you can essentially access the other agencies listed here who are partners in the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasures Enterprise, which is known colloquially as the FEMC. So, for example, if you approached BARDA with something that was actually more appropriate for, say, NIH or for CDC or for DOD, those partners can be brought in as participants up front in the discussion. And so you don't have to go searching around to all the different agencies who might be interested in your particular idea or product. Could I have the next slide, please? So the BARDA broad agency announcement, as Dean describes, is usually very broad, but now is really focused on COVID-19. This is for awards for research and development projects up to about $8 million. The topic areas for ChemBio, Rad Nuke, medical countermeasures are sort of put on hold for the moment. I think pandemic influenza is still operable or open for submissions, but I would double check that because that might change over time. And the focus is really on COVID-19. So under the standard broad agency announcement process, it's a two-step process where you first submit a white paper and then potentially get invited to submit a full proposal. The link to that broad agency announcement is shown on this slide, which you will eventually be able to have a copy of. Could I have the next slide, please? So BARDA has also instituted something called the EASY BAA, which is a faster process for smaller awards, and it's intended to focus on emerging disruptive ideas. The areas of interest are listed on the next slide, so I'll hold off on that. Just requires a simplified abstract and a quicker review turnaround in theory. And again, the link to that is at the bottom of the bullet list here. And the next slide, thanks Jennifer, lists the areas of interest for this EASY BAA, BARDA funding for COVID-19. I think this also applies to the full BAA. I'm not going to read the list to you, but obviously it's completely focused on COVID-19 for vaccines, drugs, other countermeasures, as well as diagnostics and devices. Could I have a next slide, please? So I have a slide that shows a little more detail on this, but overall, the broad agency announcement process is best kicked off with what's called a Tech Watch meeting, which I'll explain in just a moment, followed by the submission of a white paper, which is a fairly brief description of what you're proposing and a pretty high-level estimate of a budget. It doesn't require fully detailed, broken out budget. If that is reviewed favorably, you might be invited to submit a full proposal. And if a full proposal is reviewed favorably and approved, you would enter into contract negotiations that would ultimately result in a contract award, hopefully. And the next slide is a graphic depiction of this, so I'm not going to go through it with you. I would say that the broad agency announcement itself in total is over 100 pages long, and it essentially is almost a product development guidebook. So if you have any questions about what stage your product is at or what BARDA would need to see in order to favorably consider supporting the development, I would refer you to that document because it's pretty extensive. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Tech Watch meeting a few moments ago. This is really important. It's BARDA, in its original legislation, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, there's a clause in there that stipulates that BARDA is supposed to reach out to industry to learn about new ideas and what's out there and available and be receptive to that. And so when we established BARDA and created it, we needed a mechanism to do this. So one of the mechanisms that we established was the Tech Watch meeting, where you can submit a request, describe your product or your idea, and meet either virtually or in person with BARDA experts and be able to show your data, have a conversation to understand how your product or idea fits in with BARDA's priorities, gives you an opportunity to describe your path to regulatory approval or hear their perspectives on the path to regulatory approval. And it's an opportunity to have a conversation and get questions answered, which is a conversation that you cannot have once you've initiated the process of submitting formal proposals. Next slide recaps the benefits of this Tech Watch meeting. You gain visibility, you receive feedback. We did an analysis a number of years ago, actually, that showed that people who had taken the time to do a Tech Watch meeting had a much higher % success rate in getting BAA contract awards than people who didn't go through the process of doing a Tech Watch meeting. So it's a good thing to do and well worth the investment of time and effort. And my last slide, next, just outlines BARDA core services. These are core services or assistance or consultation that can be provided to those folks that BARDA is supporting under a contract award through their animal study network. They have flexible manufacturing facilities. They have technical expertise across a wide range of areas. They have a group in BARDA that does nothing but regulatory affairs, another group that does quality systems, another group that oversees clinical studies. So once you're in with them, you can get a lot of assistance in these different areas as appropriate for your product or for your company. And with that, I'll close out and hand it back to Dean.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, so you're interested in advanced development and you're wondering, how do I find the opportunities that I can apply for? Next slide. Well, there used to be something called FedBizOps, Federal Business Opportunities, a database of more than 20,000 opportunities. But, next slide, the government could not leave well enough alone. They got rid of FedBizOps, replaced it with something called SAM.gov. Next slide, please. And SAM.gov has not been nearly as good as FedBizOps. This letter you can see on the left is from an industry group that represents companies that do a lot of business with the federal government. And you can see some quotes on the right. You forced small businesses to acquire commercial software that costs tens of thousands of dollars for comparable search activities. If this had the same notoriety as something else, people would have been fired. Is there an award for the worst government system launch ever? Next slide. So it is what it is. And there are some resources out there to help people navigate through this sometimes confusing list of opportunities. And the leader out there is something called GovWin. And it's a subscription service, and it starts at $6,000 per year per user. But if you're thinking of doing it, the expense doesn't stop there, because you need to devote at least a 0.5 FTE person to get the training and to devote their time staying current in this area. There are some alternative subscription services, but they basically work the same way. But there is another option, and that option is particularly well suited for small businesses, and that option is to have a consultant identify opportunities for you. And we have such a consultant here today. Next slide. And before I introduce him, I want to tell you about the capability that he's directed. His name is Conrad Clyburn, and he's built a truly impressive medical R&D funding database based on some mind mapping software called the Brain. And he didn't just start on this yesterday. He's been building it for the past 20 years and spends an hour or two every day maintaining it and keeping it current. And it's now at the point where it has more than 100,000 elements. Next slide. And in just a moment, Conrad Clyburn is going to tell us about some selected current COVID-19 opportunities. But before he does, let me introduce him. Conrad, also known as CC Clyburn, has been the Director of Programs for the U.S. Army Medical R&D Command's Telemedicine and Advanced Technology Research Center, known as TATRC. He has been the Director of Community Development for the Open Source Electronic Health Record Alliance, called OSERA. This was a VA initiative. He has been the Associate Director of the Imaging Science and Information Systems Center, the ISIS Center, at Georgetown University. While Conrad was on active duty in the Army, he was the Medical Operations Advisor to the Saudi Arabia Ministry of Defense. CC is the founder and CEO of MedForesight. This is a business intelligence firm focused on business development and program management across medical technology platforms. And despite all of these distinguished achievements, I like to think that the one that CC is the most proud of is the fact that he is a senior consultant for my group, the Medical Red Team. And with that, I turn the mic to you, CC.
All right, thank you, Dean. If we could go to the next slide. What I am going to do is go from a 50,000 foot level down to where the rubber meets the road of individual case studies and actual funding opportunities. The COVID funding was distributed in 3 appropriations, starting all in March of 2020. During phase 1, we saw a bill that entitled the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriation Act. In early March, it appropriated $8.3 billion for vaccines and small business disaster loans and Medicare enabled telemedicine. About $3 billion of the initial appropriation went for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And most of that went to BARDA and into NIH. In the second phase of funding, we had a $100 billion commitment around the 18th of March for the Families First Corona Response Act. That mainly went to paid sick leave, free coronavirus testing, and expanded food and other assistance for first responders, food assistance and first responder support. Next slide. In the third phase of the response, that's where we see a historic commitment of funding for not only the $2.2 trillion commitment overall in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, on the 27th of March. About $945 million of those dollars went to NIH through a number of different institutes, through NIAID, through National Heart, Lung, and Blood, through the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging, Bioengineering, NLM, NCATS, and through the NIH Office of the Director. About $4.3 billion went to CDC. $1.5 billion of that is being executed extramurally at the local and regional level. We mentioned earlier, Dean had mentioned earlier that FDA did get some support, about $80 million. Of the medical research funding, the execution obligation of those dollars has been extended through September of 2024. So it's not 1 or 2 year money, but there's actually been extended beyond that. There were other components of the federal enterprise that also received funding. About $75 million went to National Science Foundation for COVID research. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, got about $66 million. Dean had mentioned that the FCC received about $200 million to support telemedicine, and about almost $100 million went to the Department of Energy for access to their high-performance computing capabilities. Next slide. So in terms of a specific example of how that money is actually being accessed, distributed, and executed, here's one example. It's a notional example, just to give a demonstration of how we go from a major appropriation to an actual distribution. In this case, we're looking at a new chemical entity that is relevant to SARS, COVID-19, that has antiviral and immunomodulator capabilities or properties. Dean had mentioned earlier the congressionally directed medical research program. There's a specific program there under the DoD peer-reviewed medical research program that will fund emerging viral disease research with a focus on COVID-19, both clinical trials, investigator-initiated research, and technology and therapeutic development. Dean had mentioned earlier OTAs, other transaction agreements or authorities that are quasi-governmental entities. The medical, chem, bio, radiological, and nuclear defense consortia, they have an opportunity for therapeutics that they'll fund for post-exposure, and post-symptomatic studies of COVID-19 therapeutics that were initially developed, for other conditions other than COVID-19. And then, of course, we had mentioned earlier the broad agency announcement at BARDA, where there is a specific section for immunomodulators or therapeutics targeting lung repair. And that's one of about a dozen areas of interest mentioned in the BARDA box. Next slide, please. A second example is for a chemotherapeutic that is being repurposed from cancer, but that also has antiviral activity that might be relevant to COVID-19. Dean had mentioned earlier another OTA, the MTech, the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortia, and they have a funding opportunity for prototype development to combat COVID-19, and this specifically is for the repurposing of an FDA-approved drug or biologic that has already demonstrated safety in humans for a condition other than COVID-19. At NIAID, there are emergency awards that are available through 2021. Specifically, they're looking at in one of the funding opportunities for antiviral activity of existing or candidate therapeutics initially developed for other indications. And then Dean had mentioned SBIR, Small Business Innovative Research, and again, NIAID through 2021 has a special notice for SBIRs that would be relevant to the development of therapeutic candidates related to coronavirus strains. Next slide, please. And the last example is on the medical device side. There we looked at a client, a notional client that had developed a light ventilator that was looking for an emergency use authorization through FDA, and then a rapid securing of a procurement contract for scaling and distribution of the new technology. BARDA on the R&D side has a specific topic area for ventilators, AO111. The Deputy Assistant Secretary for Army Research and Technology just completed a ventilator challenge where they were looking at awarding up to $1 million for ventilators that use novel materials for weight reduction and survivability. Again, the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortia, which is an OTA, just announced some awards for eventually, ultimately, up to $30 to $40 million, which included critical care network capabilities, a component of which included next generation ventilators. And then the U.S. Army Medical Advanced Development Agency, or USAMRDC, up at Fort Detrick, has been working closely with the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA on a accelerated project called the Ventilator Integration Team Joint Acquisition Task Force Supply Chain Stabilization Effort, where they're looking at the acquisition of ventilators and the distribution of those nationwide in a rapid fashion. And there we would put a client in direct contact, perhaps with Dr. Tyler Bennett, who is the liaison from the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command to Homeland Security, looking at the ventilator issue. Next slide, please. And the last slide is kind of a real-world example of a journey that a company, not our client, recently has made, where there's been a pretty rapid evolution from pioneering academic research into product development and potentially now into wide-scale distribution of a new discovery entity. And in this case, we're looking at Ridgeback Biotherapeutics. Ridgeback recently working with Emory University, established a relationship, initially looking at one of the Emory-developed experimental treatments for Ebola, which was funded by DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, in 2016. They licensed that property in 2018. They maintained that relationship with the academic researchers at Emory, and Emory received a NIAID award of $15 million to develop a corollary property, EIDD 2801, for coronaviruses and flus. Ridgeback licensed that from Emory in early 2020, and that property now has been the center of a collaboration between Ridgeback and Merck, where both in the United States and UK is moving into rapid trials as a therapeutic, oral therapeutic for coronavirus. So this is a demonstration of how government funding, academic and industry collaboration, all can work together along with coordination with regulators to rapidly advance a technology through the process. So, Dean, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, CC. And I'd like to thank all of you that are still online with us throughout this webinar. Before we wrap up, I'd like to review what we've talked about. We talked about the tech base on the left-hand side versus advanced development, the two components of the medical product life cycle. We talked about some R&D organizations in the Department of Defense. We talked about medical countermeasures, funding mechanisms. Carol talked in some degree about BARDA, and then we discussed how do you find opportunities, and we finished off with Conrad giving us some examples of opportunities. If anyone out there is interested in more information, please contact us. We'd be glad to talk to you. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to you, Thomas.
Thanks. This is a terrific presentation. Very much appreciate that information. I can say from a personal standpoint, I've always known that there's quite an alphabet soup of agencies and programs, but it was all Greek to me, and this is a very helpful laying out of the landscape, so I very much appreciate it. We do have questions that have been posted in the chat box. I would urge others who may have other questions to do so, type it into the chat box, but just to go through them as they exist. James asked, where can independent consultants and consulting firms in GMP, manufacturing, development, quality, and supply chain best discover potential projects to participate in? And I know that we presented, you can subscribe to an expensive service, you can go to people like Dean and Cece. What advice do you have for independent consultants who want to know how they can get involved in such projects? Anyone on the panel, please.
Dean, this is Conrad. Do you think that establishing a dialogue with USAMRDA might be helpful for that type of organization?
Sure, I do, CC, and you know, for something like this, the devil is always in the details. I would say it depends on, for instance, James, who had the question, his area of expertise, his background, what areas he's been working in the past, and certainly we can point him in some directions, but also a dialogue with the folks at Kinexum. There's probably, I would say in the neighborhood of about 30 of us that are affiliated with Kinexum with divergent backgrounds. And I'm sure Jennifer or Thomas could refer James to someone that would have a background in GMP and manufacturing.
Okay, terrific. Chandra asks, are all the programs mentioned open to Canadian companies?
I'll take that. This is Dean. Most of these programs are open to foreign companies. I know one of our past clients was an Israeli company, and we got them pointed in the right direction, and they have had a very successful relationship with BARDA in developing products for BARDA. So I think as a rule, foreign companies are eligible. There may be some exceptions.
Carol, any comments from a BARDA side?
I think what Dean said is quite accurate. I think in some recent legislation there might have been some language about preference for U.S. companies in some specific area. I can't really recall what I think I read, but the reality is that many, especially larger pharmaceutical companies, are international, and so we've always, in my entire tenure in the government, always interacted with foreign companies, with the exception of obviously certain countries, to support product development.
Okay, super. Clara has another question, or Libby. We are acquiring COVID-19 data on veterans regarding testing, hospitalizations, and survival, along with publicly available data from the Department of Labor and Census Bureau on demographic and labor market information. Do you see any funding opportunities for health services research in COVID-19 for military and veterans? I know that when we were preparing for this webinar, I kind of guided folks to talk to product development opportunities, but I do remember seeing references to different telemedicine this and processes and AI processing power and so forth. What is there for this kind of health services research?
Well, this question is from my good friend and colleague Libby Dismuke, who's at the organization at the Palo Alto VA, the Healthcare Economics Resource Center, and really has a great understanding of how our healthcare dollars are being spent. And Libby, I would say to you, one place to go would be the CDC. They are funding, data collection, data surveillance. I know you have some connections there. We have some other connections, and that would be one source. Another source is right next door, actually part of the Palo Alto VA, and that is the VA's biosurveillance office headed up by Dr. Michael Holodny. He heads up the biosurveillance for all of the VA out of the Palo Alto VA, and I'd be glad to connect you with him offline.
And there's one other agency, although I don't think they would be focused on military, but that would be HRSA, and I apologize for blanking out on exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's Health Research something agencies. It's within HHS, so you can find it through the HHS website, but they do that type of research, again, though, probably focused more on the civilian and not military sector.
And this is Conrad. I would agree with Carol's mentioning HRSA, and then there's AHRQ, Agency for Health Research and Quality, that might be interested in that intersection, and also the National Library of Medicine at NIH, which does quite a bit of medical informatics research. They did receive an additional appropriation specific to coronavirus, and they may also have interest and funding to support that type of effort.
Terrific. Are there any other questions that people have? I know that there are about a dozen callers who are not logged in. Maybe we'll try to give you an opportunity to speak up for a moment. Anyone who wants to come off mute and say, I have a question, we can recognize you. This is one of the infirmities of a virtual meeting. We can't have interactivity. We'd love to find out what the interest and the composition of the audience is so that we can tailor our comments and maybe provoke some thoughts or discussions. I will say that if you have follow-up questions you'd like to pose to the panelists, you can certainly write, for everyone except CC, you can have first name, last name at kinexum.com, and you can reach the individual panelists. You can always write to Jennifer Zhao, the organizer of this conference, whose email is in the various promotions for the webinar, and she can get you in touch with CC and others as well. We did schedule this for because we had a fair amount of content to present. We wanted to be sure that there was time for questions, answers, and discussions. Can I maybe open this up to one sort of closing discussion amongst the panelists, a panel discussion about what the role of federal funding can be? I think from the standpoint of an entrepreneur or product developer, we know that federal funding is out there, and non-dilutive funding is always good. It's better than not having funding. But I've always been a little bit intimidated by the cycles, the turnaround cycles. If you start a process, it's non-trivial to apply for something. It's a competitive process, and when you get the review process, the time to funding may be many months. I know that in these urgencies, things may be speeded up. And I've certainly had the experience of proposing a project to fund, and we couldn't wait that long, so we had to go find other funding to do some of the stuff we asked the government to fund because the funding wouldn't come for 9 or 12 months. Could you maybe comment on the pros and cons of applying to the federal government for this kind of funding?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm one of the folks calling in from a phone and have been unable to see the slides, but this is Pepper Lanson from Protego, and we are an early-stage drug company. And first and foremost, thanks to everybody on the panel. It's been an incredible delivery of understandable information about the federal government spectrum of funding. my question is, I'm curious to know what the panel thinks about BARDA's proclivities to double down on vaccines. We were one of the companies that had a really successful Corona Watch meeting, and then suddenly, I think it was BAA Amendment 17 that sliced the pie back to being all vaccines and nothing else. So a number of companies got sort of squashed in that changeover. Does anybody imagine that the government will become reinterested in something other than vaccines for the lion's share of funding? Like, for instance, therapeutics to treat some of the complications that are essentially killing patients in hospital, but not directly antivirals.
So this is Carol. So you're specifically talking about COVID-19?
Yes.
Coronavirus? Yeah. Well, obviously, the focus on vaccines is because you want to prevent people from getting sick, period, right? So, and arguably, vaccines were the most obvious countermeasure to jump on. I mean, it's not like people were starting from blank sheets of paper. There were, several different types of platforms that were readily available for exploration, like mRNA vaccines. There were SARS and MERS vaccine candidates that had been in development over the past 10 years or so that never really came to fruition for a variety of reasons. I would also argue that in the most general of terms, when you're talking about viruses, that vaccines have achieved greater successes in general than antiviral drugs. It's been a long haul to develop antiviral drugs and get to where we are today with HIV treatments, with hepatitis treatments, and so forth. But I would anticipate perhaps that once this huge effort to achieve effective, safe vaccines for coronavirus gets to that point, which hopefully will occur sooner rather than later, that yes, I do believe that attention would turn to the therapeutics and to the treatment of these other conditions that appear to be very serious sequelae of coronavirus infection.
Can I comment a little bit, Dean? I see that you're crouching forward as well, but Pepper's question is really important because in terms of having impact, if you're an applicant and a program has made an administrative decision to prioritize something, it's not a lot that an individual grant applicant can do about it. I have looked around at the national response in principle to the virus. And of course, vaccines make a lot of sense, but it's sexy and it's a one-stop solution, assuming we can snap our fingers and get there. But if you were to ask me, and what do I count for? But I think that vaccines are going to take a while. It's astonishing the technical progress we've made. It typically takes years to get a vaccine, and in this case, we seem to have efficacy data within 6 to 12 months. It's stunning, a global race for vaccines. But this is not Ebola. This is COVID-19, where the vast majority of folks are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, and so it would take a vaccine would have to be awfully safe in order to be something that much of the population would be rushing forward to take. So what struck me was that you'd want to prioritize somewhere in the mix repurposing of therapeutics to shore people up. So that's a prioritization that I see, but I don't know where the government is, it's not just government. We've heard reports of folks at the Gates Foundation. They're actually prioritizing repurposing over new molecular entities, and that might make sense from the standpoint of getting to patients. So that kind of prioritization discussions are happening philosophically, but I don't have a specific piece of advice for Pepper on what to do if you've kind of been frozen out because of the current prioritization. I see that James made a similar comment. Repurposed medicines have a potential impact. Vaccines, or at least I think he means the disease people who contract COVID-19 the fastest, with the most immediate public health impact, not vaccines, and with their unproven technology or some of their novel technology. Actually, I think Operation Warp Speed doesn't have some of the standard approaches. I think Scott Gottlieb made a mention to that. So, any other comments?
Yeah, this is Dean. I've got a few other comments. First of all, we've seen this before, where the government appropriates large amounts of money to respond to a crisis. We saw this early on in the Obama administration, responding to the economic crisis that we were facing. And it takes a while for the government to assimilate all of this massive bolus of funding. The analogy I think of is if you've ever seen a boa constrictor, swallow its prey, there's a big lump just behind the head initially as that boa constrictor starts to digest it. And we're just at the early phases of the government organizations swallowing this large bolus of money. And a key point that Conrad made is this money is going to be around through 2024. Typically, the way the money is executed, it doesn't last that long, but it's such a large bolus, they made a provision so it's going to be around for a while. Secondly, I'm sorry that caller did not have access to the slides, and I know Jennifer is going to get the slide set out to everyone, but when you do look at the slide set, I would call your attention to a slide that Conrad talked about, slide number 63, case study number 2, repurposing chemotherapeutics. And he gave 3 examples, which by no means is supposed to be an exhaustive list, but he gave an example at the MTech and 2 examples at NIAID where they do have funding programs to repurpose that, to look at repurposed drugs. So there's a lot of different offices, and if you're getting roadblocks from one group, I would just suggest that you look for other opportunities elsewhere, because I think they do exist. So that's all.
Well, Sir Pepper, I hope that's a response. It's probably not a great response for you, other than that there are multiple sources of funding, and so you have a chance to apply. It's a lot more work, but you can see whether, if you're stymied in one program, you can look for other sources of money. And also, we should have this national discussion on priorities, as James has referenced in the chat column, and we have our individual views about what should be properly prioritized. Any other questions or comments? Well, I think with that, then let me take this occasion to thank the panelists for a terrific presentation. To reiterate, we will have the slides and the YouTube video of this webinar posted online at the Kinexum.com website. And Jennifer will send to all the registrants of this webcast the links when they're available, probably within the next couple of business days. And with that, I would wish everyone a good day and a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.